Sometimes a letter brings a nation to silence. The studio lights were warm that night, as they always were on The Tonight Show. The audience had just finished laughing at Johnny Carson's opening monologue. Doc Severinsen and the NBC orchestra were ready for the next cue. Ed McMahon sat at his desk, pen in hand, smiling at something Johnny had just said. It was 1971, and everything was running like clockwork. Then Johnny stopped mid-sentence. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The laughter died instantly. His face changed. The smile that America knew so well disappeared, replaced by something no one had seen before on that stage: raw, unfiltered gravity. Doc looked up from his music stand. Ed's smile faded. The audience, sensing the shift, went completely silent. Johnny looked at the paper in his hands, then up at the camera. His voice, usually so smooth and controlled, carried a weight that reached through every television screen in America. "I received a letter today," he said quietly. "And I think we need to stop for a moment." Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The Tonight Show had never stopped like this before. Not for anything. Not for anyone. But Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host that night. He was something else entirely. He was about to become a vessel for a story that needed to be told. Behind the cameras, producers looked at each other in confusion. This wasn't in the script. Nothing was written down. But no one moved to stop him. Something in Johnny's posture, and the way he held that letter, told everyone in that studio, this matters. The letter had arrived that afternoon. It came in a simple envelope, postmarked from a small town in Iowa. The return address was written in a woman's careful handwriting. Inside was another envelope, and inside that, a single page torn from a notepad. Johnny had read it alone in his dressing room. He'd sat there for 20 minutes, holding it, reading it again and again. When his assistant knocked to tell him it was time, he'd folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He hadn't told anyone what he was going to do. Now, standing on that stage, under those lights, with millions watching, Johnny made a choice. He made a choice that no producer would have ever allowed, no network executive would have approved, no protocol would have permitted. He was going to read the letter. "This letter," Johnny said, his voice steady but quiet, "was written by a young Marine. His name was David. He was 19 years old. He wrote this letter to his mother 3 days before he was killed in Vietnam." The studio went from silent to something beyond silence. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear the air itself, where every breath becomes audible, where time seems to bend. Johnny unfolded the paper. His hands, which had held thousands of cue cards with perfect comedic timing, now trembled slightly. "Dear Mom," he began. The letter was short. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't have big words or philosophical thoughts. It was written by a teenager who was scared and trying not to show it. It talked about the heat, about missing home, about hoping to be back for Christmas. It talked about the guys in his unit, about a joke someone told, about how the food wasn't as bad as everyone said. And then, at the end, it said something that broke every heart in that studio and in every living room across America. "If something happens to me, Mom, I want you to know I wasn't scared. I want you to know I did my job. And I want you to know that when I thought about home, I thought about you in the kitchen, and Dad in the garage, and Susie probably hogging the phone. That's what I was protecting. That's what mattered." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny's voice cracked on the last line. He stopped, looked down at the paper, and took a breath. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "David's mother sent this to me," Johnny said. "She wanted people to know. She wanted people to understand what her son believed in. What he died for." Ed McMahon, sitting at his desk, had tears running down his face. Doc Severinsen had put down his trumpet. In the audience, women were crying openly. Men who had fought in World War II and Korea sat frozen, remembering their own letters, their own fears, their own friends who never came home. Johnny carefully folded the letter and placed it on his desk. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't make a joke to break the tension. He didn't do anything to make it easier. He just let it sit there. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 seconds, nobody moved. The broadcast continued in complete silence. Millions of Americans sat in their living rooms, staring at their television screens, connected by something deeper than entertainment. Then, slowly, one person in the audience stood up. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet. But they weren't applauding. They were standing in respect, in mourning, in recognition of something sacred. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny looked out at the audience, at all those people standing, and he did something that would become one of the most remembered moments in television history. He walked out from behind his desk. He walked down the steps, off the stage, and into the audience. He found an older man in the third row, a man wearing a Navy veteran's cap, and he shook his hand. He found a young woman who was crying and he simply stood next to her for a moment, saying nothing. The cameras followed him, but the producers had the sense not to cut away. This was real. This was important. This was television doing what it was always meant to do, connect human beings to each other. When Johnny returned to his desk, he didn't sit down immediately. He stood there, one hand resting on the letter, and he spoke directly to the camera. "I don't know what to say after that," he admitted. "I don't think there's anything to say. But I think we needed to stop for a moment. We needed to remember. We needed to honor David, and every person like him who gave everything for a country that sometimes forgets to say thank you." He paused, then added quietly, "Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." The show went to commercial. In the control room, the director sat with his head in his hands. The producers stood in stunned silence. Phone lines to NBC were already lighting up, but they weren't complaints. They were people calling to say thank you. To say they'd been moved. To say they'd never forget. When they came back from commercial, Johnny didn't do comedy. He brought out his scheduled guest, a young comedian trying to make it in show business, but the tone had changed. Everything was gentler, more human, more real. At the end of the show, as the credits rolled, the camera held on Johnny at his desk. The letter was still there, folded, a small piece of paper that had stopped time. The next morning, newspapers across America ran stories about what had happened on The Tonight Show. Not reviews. Not entertainment coverage. Real news stories about a moment of genuine humanity on television. David's mother received thousands of letters. She heard from veterans, from families of fallen soldiers, from people who just wanted to say they remembered, they cared, they understood. Johnny never talked about that night in interviews. He never used it for publicity. The letter stayed in his desk drawer for the rest of his time on The Tonight Show, and when he retired, he gave it to the Smithsonian with a simple note. This mattered. Years later, young talk show hosts studying Carson's technique would watch tapes of that night. They'd see him break every rule, ignore every protocol, risk everything for a moment of truth. And they'd understand something fundamental about what it means to connect with an audience. It's not about the jokes. It's not about the ratings. It's not even about the entertainment. It's about being human when it matters most. In the months that followed that broadcast, something remarkable happened across America. Television stations received requests to replay that segment. Schools asked for copies to show students. Veterans organizations wrote to NBC asking for permission to use the footage in memorial services. Johnny received letters from families who had lost sons, brothers, fathers in Vietnam. Some thanked him for giving their grief a voice. Others sent their own letters, their own final words from loved ones who never returned. Johnny read every single one. He kept them in a box in his office, and on difficult days, when the pressure of nightly television felt overwhelming, he would open that box and remember why he did what he did. There was one letter in particular that stayed with him. It came from a Marine sergeant who had served with David. He wrote about the day David died, about how he'd been trying to help a wounded soldier when the mortar hit. He wrote about finding David's letters in his pack afterward, about making sure they got sent home. He wrote about how watching Johnny read that letter on television had given him something he'd been searching for since the war: closure. "I've carried David with me for 3 years," the sergeant wrote. "Every day, I've wondered if what we did mattered. If anyone back home understood. Last night, watching you honor him on national television, I finally felt like someone did. Thank you for stopping your show. Thank you for making America stop with you." Johnny never replied to that letter with words. Instead, he invited the sergeant to appear on The Tonight Show. The interview was quiet, respectful, nothing like the usual celebrity banter. The two men simply talked about David, about the war, about what it meant to come home. At the end, Johnny shook the sergeant's hand and said something the microphones barely picked up. "Your friend's letter changed me." Behind the scenes at The Tonight Show, that night became a touchstone for everyone who worked there. New writers joining the staff would be told about it. Camera operators who'd been there would describe the feeling in the studio. Producers used it as an example when debates arose about what content was appropriate, about whether certain moments should be cut for time. Would Johnny have stopped the show for this? Became the question they asked. If the answer was yes, they knew it mattered. The letter itself, that folded piece of paper that had traveled from a battlefield in Vietnam to a studio in Burbank to a museum in Washington, became more than just an artifact. It became a symbol of what television could be when it chose humanity over entertainment, truth over comfort, silence over noise. Historians studying the Vietnam War era often point to that Tonight Show broadcast as a turning point in how America processed the conflict. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't propaganda. It was simply a moment of acknowledgement, a pause in the national conversation to remember that behind every uniform was a person, behind every casualty report was a family grieving. The Tonight Show continued for decades after that night. Johnny made people laugh millions more times. He interviewed presidents and movie stars and musicians. He created countless memorable moments. But ask anyone who was alive in 1971 and watched television, and they'll tell you, they remember the night Johnny Carson stopped the show to read a letter from a Marine who never came home. They remember because in that moment, television was more than television. It was a mirror, a memorial, a connection between strangers who suddenly weren't strangers anymore. The letter, now preserved in museum glass, sits in the National Museum of American History. Next to it is a small plaque with a quote from Johnny Carson, taken from an interview he gave years later when he finally agreed to talk about that night. "I didn't plan it," he said. "But when I read that letter in my dressing room, I knew I had to share it. Because David's mother trusted me with her son's last words. And when someone trusts you with something that sacred, you don't make jokes. You don't move on. You stop. And you honor it." The plaque also includes the final line from David's letter, the one that Johnny read with a breaking voice. "That's what I was protecting. That's what mattered." In the age of viral videos and trending moments, that night on The Tonight Show remains a lesson in the power of genuine emotion, of breaking format for truth, of remembering that behind every statistic, every news report, every distant war, there are real people with real families who love them. Johnny Carson taught America how to laugh for 3 decades. But on that one night in 1971, he taught America something more important. How to stop and feel, how to honor sacrifice, how to be present for pain. The studio audience that night never forgot it. The television viewers never forgot it. And David's mother, who lived another 20 years, never forgot that a man she never met took her son's words and made sure the country heard them. That's the power of television when it's done right. That's the legacy of Johnny Carson beyond the comedy. That's the moment when entertainment became something more. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Sometimes a letter brings a nation to silence. And sometimes, in that silence, we find what matters most.